Grand Theft Auto, one of the biggest franchises in gaming's history, and GTA 5 made a huge impact on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Now back with another re-release thanks to the current generation of consoles, is this the third time to charm for GTA 5? So this latest release of GTA does have some significant improvements over even the best the PC has to offer. Here we now get ray tracing, 4K and 60 FPS, just not all at the same time. It does offer one big advantage over previous console releases though, and that is that 60 FPS output, which wasn't possible prior to this generation due to the CPU limitations. The value here is actually surprisingly good. $10 to $20 depending on PlayStation or Xbox does at least represent the value the port offers, and the publisher is aware.
You f***ing with me, right?
So what does this offer then? Well, like I say, 3 modes for both the PS5 and Series X, 2 modes for the Series S, and generally performance is very impressive across the board considering the options that are at play. Let me quickly summarise what those options are first though. So on the PlayStation 5 and Series X, you get a fidelity mode which operates at a native 3840 by 2160 at 30 FPS. There's no dynamic resolution scaling here. It obviously wasn't available in the original engine, and they haven't done that level of update to the original title. That is still a very clean and crisp image, offering excellent visual quality on top of the additional boost this mode offers, which I'll get into in the graphics comparison. In addition to this, we also have a performance ray tracing mode, the RT mode, which now does the same thing but drops the resolution down to an equally fixed 2560 by 1440, but this time targeting 60 FPS. And then the final mode is just flat performance, where those ray tracing options are turned off, but it still targets the same fixed 2560 by 1440 on both consoles, and it just uses that to achieve a more stable 60 FPS where some of those issues may arise. The Series S literally doesn't have any ray tracing options, so it sticks with the fidelity option or performance option. This means no ray trace additions to this particular mode, but it still does have significant improvements over all previous releases, even some above and beyond the PC release. So what is performance like then? Well, let's remind ourselves just how this title launched back in the day. Now, using the PlayStation 3 as a representation of the last generation versions, which did include the Xbox 360, this really summarises and reinforces how technically ambitious, outstanding and talented the team were, and still remains an impressive title across that entire generation, most specifically around the hoops and the known constraints of that hardware that all developers had to jump through. All these issues notwithstanding, it obviously did have performance issues, even at 1280 by 720, a relatively high resolution on a lot of multi-platform titles for the PS3. But it certainly can dip during driving around cityscapes in combat, sub 30 most of the time, sub 20 in heavier sections. It can feel quite jarring and jittery when you play it now. But visually, it's still impressive and fundamentally the same game underneath as we're playing right now on the PS5 and Series X.
We got to go!
A beer would be good for that kid. Come on, man! What happened to this dude?
The version of GTA 5 that really cemented itself is the one that most people are now aware of. The PS4 and Xbox One releases a little under a year later really cemented all of the visual quality we now expect and formed the basis of this updated version. So resolution was bumped to 1920 by 1080 on both. It still ran at 30 FPS, but it improved density of LOD, shadow quality, tessellation and texture details all significantly improved, and then about a year later the PC version pushed that even further. Now that hasn't changed significantly here, with many of the aspects of the title being pretty much identical to those, but there are some improvements. One of the biggest though is absolutely performance. The PS4 and the Xbox One did have some mild judder traversing through cityscapes at fast speeds on the initial release, but that was patched out later on in its life cycle, and now it's pretty close to a 30 FPS title most of the time. This is obviously resolved in all modes most of the time on the new generation consoles, but there are some caveats to that. So in general, fidelity, that mode is absolutely rock solid. It doesn't dip on the PlayStation 5 and Series X from all of my tested sections, comparing some heavier combat areas, obviously traveling through the world at fast pace. This is all at the highest visual settings with the highest resolution of a native 4K. It really holds lock solid. So there isn't a great deal to discuss here. I'm not going to focus much more time on it. If you do play at 30 FPS, it obviously has a big problem though, and that is the input latency. This title is heavily dependent on the Havok physics engine for its animation system, and that drastically slows down movement, which can feel incredibly heavy and slow when you move it on the controller. That's exacerbated by two areas. The first of which is the input time is very high in this mode. On average or median, 190 milliseconds give or take is the input time, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. Driving is better because of rigid body cars, but that really is quite heavy and slow for this kind of title. The other part that adds to that is the fact that it really relies on the Havok's physics system for its animation, and that means that things are weighted and move slowly. This means that when you move forward, it can take time to step in, and obviously when you let go, it can take time to slow. That means changing direction and fast movement just isn't possible in the title. Like I say, it gets away with it slightly in driving because those cars don't suffer from that quite as much. Generally though, it's not the mode that I can play because it's too unresponsive and it feels very heavy. And also, even though that motion blur, which was present in the previous generation versions as well in terms of a subtle camera motion blur, and on PC you could push that even higher, it certainly is a good looking title, but one that sacrifices too much in terms of input for me to choose. And that's also balanced out by the fact that the performance modes do drop the resolution in a numbers game quite significantly to 1440p, but from a visual perspective it doesn't make a huge amount of difference. Some of this is the fact that the textures are by and large the same as the best the PC had to offer a few years back, and that means at 1440p it's kind of the perfect balance. It's still a 77% higher resolution than 1080p, but it now runs the game at twice the temporal resolution because you're getting twice the frames. And that means it not only looks smoother, appears cleaner, but also input time is reduced. Again, it's still a heavy game and they're not going to fix that overnight, but you can see a reduction of around 45%, going down to a median now of 127 milliseconds, and at times on certain actions it can creep just under 100 milliseconds. Still pretty high for a 60 FPS title, but certainly much better than what it feels like in that fidelity mode. And this brings us on to the performance in this mode. Again, like fidelity, 99% of the time, give or take, it is a pretty much locked 60 FPS. Certainly better than most PCs ran the title, and even more powerful PCs now, but I'll touch on that in the PC section. But there are points that can cause dips. Comparing these two here, some of those are specific to the improvements this new version adds. So again, there are improvements over and above just those ray trace shadows. And I'm going to touch on one here, which is the alpha effects and explosions, including the particles, have been significantly improved. Compared here to the PC's best on maximum settings, that semi-opaque fire sprite is very weak compared to the latest one here, which is very dense, has a light bloom effect, and obviously is more apparent on screen. This is in addition to that higher bloom effect of the fire, that billboard smoke effect billowing around, the enhancements to the particle effects, and it also now spawns a shadow casting light source around the car. Now this is one of the reasons you can get some severe dips at certain points in the title whenever this crops up. As you can see here in a combat section with Crazy Trevor blowing things up, which he's well known for, you can see performance tanking quite heavily on both machines. Much worse on the Series X in this particular example, but you got to remember, in like-for-like comparisons, these are not always identical sets. In fact, I ran the same section again in a slightly later time of day with brighter lights, and it didn't perform as bad, much closer to what the PS5 is doing here. But in other sections it reverses and the PS5 is actually outperformed by the Series X. An example here, as Trevor takes on the bikers coming out of their camp here, it holds a lock 60 most of the time through it, but once you get to the firefight of blowing things up, slow motion, depth of field, and again the post-processing suite has been improved on this update. Across the board it seems, depth of field, motion blur, all those elements have been improved or enhanced. This means that you get some heavier dips in these sections, and that means we see the high 30s on the PS5 and the low 40s on the Series X. So again, like for like comparisons, they tend to come out very close. Overall, the PS5 is ever so slightly better performing than the Series X when it has these small performance hiccups, but that doesn't happen very often, and again, without this kind of analysis, you wouldn't really notice it. This is the worst point I could find in the title, but again, stressing the same open world yada yada yada, there's always a chance you're going to find something worse than I'm showing you here. Again, you can improve the performance by running it in performance mode. So an example here, running that same section the Series X struggled with to high 40s, it now really drops nowhere worse than the high 50s. So again, if you are susceptible to these sections, you can just pick that performance mode and it will iron them all out. So moving into the Series S, now in that performance mode, again like I stress, it really is close to the highest settings the PC has to offer, with the additions I've just mentioned in terms of those additional post effects, alpha effects, and some lacking areas I'll get to in a moment. But performance is pretty solid, but it dips in the same places and worse that the Series X would dip in, closer to what it performs in the RT mode, but in this case we're running the performance mode and it's only at 1080p. The restriction here is the same thing. The GPU is limited at certain points, specifically bandwidth and memory, and that can cause some of these heavier alpha effects and post effects to impact the performance when they crop up. In general play, attacking, driving through the city, it is pretty solid and there's no real concerns here. There are, though, some minor hiccups that can happen whilst travelling through the city at fast speeds. Randomly, little judders down to the low 50s at certain points. Now, this mirrors what we see on the PC aspect. Now, on the PC side, that is likely a bandwidth issue. As you can see here in my PC test, an RX 2700 overclocked here, so more like a 2070 Super, and that's paired with a Ryzen 2700 Plus. This is at 3.8 gigahertz. It's not CPU bound even at single core, but you can drop down to the high 30s at certain points, and that's likely that streaming issue, juddering, and just struggling to get memory from the system RAM over to the GPU pool, and that causes both the GPU and CPU to stutter and stall a little. I think this is one of the reasons we get these mild judders, is the memory allocation on the Series S causes it to struggle a little because there's that split allocation between the 2 gig for the system and the 8 gigabytes for the game. Again though, this is just me surmising at this point, but it certainly affects the Series S when it's not affecting the Series X or the PlayStation 5, and they have significantly higher bandwidth and memory than the Series S does. The fidelity mode doesn't seem to suffer at all. In traversal around the cityscape, it doesn't have these judders and skips. Again, the whole engine was designed around a 30 FPS refresh rate, and that makes perfect sense because it has a lot more time in that fixed frame rate to fit all of this in. So if you are playing at 30 FPS, again you get the same input latency I've just mentioned, but overall performance is pretty good. That isn't true of everything in this Series S version though. As I said before, when it does dip, it dips much heavier and worse than it does on the PS5 and Series X in the same sections in that performance mode, and can even go down to the low 20s in that fidelity mode. These same sections, using Trevor as the example, blowing stuff up, as you can see on screen, it does suffer. Again, these are very brief and not consistent, but if you are playing this title on the Series S, then you will experience and feel these judders in the heavier combat sections. As brief as they are clearly apparent.
Another car! We need cover, home!
Moving into those graphical comparisons between platforms, both the Series X and the PlayStation 5 have ray traced shadows. That's the extent of ray tracing in the title, and these only are active in the fidelity and RT mode. In performance, they use standard PC cascaded shadow maps. These are essentially contact hardening shadows, a soft feathered edge. Look at that little plant in front of the wall. The nearer it is to the receiving surface, the wall itself, the sharper the actual shadow map, and the further away, as in the palm tree is, it's more dithered and diffuse. These then move over to standard cascaded shadow maps when you go to performance mode, which are close to the best on PC, and that's the same for PS5 and Series X, although they look slightly lower on Series X. But the performance mode and the fidelity mode on Xbox Series S is exactly the same. Both use cascaded shadow maps, except fidelity is just a higher resolution version of those. They're not as high and sharp as the highest settings of shadows on PC, as you see here, but again, these are not really replicating the same type of shadows. They're rendered completely differently here. They did have soft shadows, but that was more of a feathered edge rather than what we see even on the Series S, where it's trying to replicate that soft distance contact hardening, which has really been improved here from the shadow maps across the board. Even the PS3 had sharper shadows when you look at them here, but it didn't have this cascaded filter you can see drawing in and out, which is frustum aligned around the character, which basically sharpens the shadow at the highest resolution possible the closer they are to the character and camera. This doesn't happen on the ray tracing mode because it's no longer worried about distance from view. Everything is rendered at the same level per pixel based on the ray tracing into the screen, so each ray samples that and then the filtering merges those together to give you a soft feathered edge, and that will scale evenly. In performance mode, just like the Series S version, you can still see that shadow cascade moving back and forth. Look on the right hand side next to those small leaves. As I move back, you can see it gets softer and sharper. A good example of this is here. As this girl walks across the screen, imagine a floating box around her, because that's exactly what's happening. As that filter passes over the shadow, you can see the quality raise and lower, and as she sits down, that is always around characters and yourself. Flicking over to ray tracing, you can see there's no cascade difference on the shadow map as she walks past. And that's because ray tracing isn't distance based, therefore it's just casting the ray back to the emitter and the occluder, and you get perfect shadows. One missed opportunity, I think, is not using or implementing ray traced reflections. It does use cube map reflections, and it uses the highest quality available on the fidelity mode on PS5, and there are lower quality on performance and performance RT. One slight advantage to the Series X here is it uses slightly higher quality cube maps in the performance mode over the PS5. Both fidelity and performance RT are the same, but there is definitely a slight advantage, although subtle, in that performance mode. Again, walking around, this stands out a great deal with no reflections of any dynamic objects, the world scaling inappropriately from that projected cube map on the glass, and therefore it stands out no matter which mode you set it on, and that matches exactly to PC. This is a great loss, I think, for options in the engine, and it is a shame that they didn't work harder to get this into the engine. Again, we've seen it on titles such as Watch Dogs Legions, which certainly had issues with it, but even that ran on the Series S with ray trace reflections against building objects and cars, and obviously Spider-Man Miles Morales used it extensively across the cityscape on the PlayStation 5, really proving and improving the performance quality over the base PS4 and Pro versions, and I think it would have been a welcome benefit here, and potentially a missed opportunity, but I don't know the ins and outs of development. There might be very good reasons why that wasn't possible to implement. They still have excellent reflections in this title, and they always did. Even back with the base PS3, they used a combination of dynamic cube maps and planar reflections. This effectively means they re-render the viewport up from the water surface to pick up dynamic objects and even parts of the scenery. These are then merged with those dynamic cube maps to create a full reflection, which includes dynamic character bodies running across the scene equal to SSR or ray tracing without those artifacts, or even without the ability to do it back in the day. This is the same technology stack that runs right up to the PS5 and Series X and the PS3, and it really reinforces how impressive their entire technology process is. You can still see the same dithering elements of billboard posters and LOD into the distance, shadow map cascades, and all of those things are very, very similar. This is the same game at heart, and not drastically different even from the PS4 version, but overall it has been improved and refined. There are other elements, such as the ray trace shadows now improving the distance off away from the camera, and obviously improving the dithering and shadow flickering that can happen, as you see on the left hand side here, even on PC's best. And because they're ray traced, they don't have that shadow cascade problem, meaning they don't disappear off into the distance, which just again improves the solidity of the world. And this is something reinforced by the now addition, which was on PC's best, dynamic shadow casting headlights on cars now, which means objects, characters, and even scenery, all dynamically cast objects on all modes on the Series X and PlayStation 5. Unfortunately, like many other areas, they are now another sacrifice on the Series S, where they just have that standard light casting source but no shadow casting, just like the PS4. Again, meaning that the Series S version does come out as feeling quite last gen. Another visual boost is the fact that it's retrofitted things like TAA from the Red Dead Redemption 2 element of the engine, and that means we now get much more stable and solid image quality even over the very best that PC offers, which, although minor, does stop a lot with the shimmering and movement and actually makes that sacrifice down from 4K not quite as bad because it does hold up pretty well. Loading is another boost, being much faster now and actually slightly faster on Series X and Series S consoles than PS5, and actually much faster than PC, but obviously that hasn't been enhanced with this version. Again, booting from the main menu and then quitting out and doing it again, it is much faster, but it's still slightly faster on the Series consoles, showing you that this is at heart a programming port to improve elements of the title and obviously enhance it on these new consoles, but it really isn't taking advantage of them because fundamentally it's a last gen game at heart, which overall is a nice boost to the visual package the game offers. But if you have played this title on anything else other than a PS4 and a PC, then you might see some substantial upgrades. But if you have got it on any of those consoles, then other than the frame rate boost, you're probably not going to think this is a revolution in terms of updates. It's nice, it's cheap, but it's still GTA 5 at heart.
Come on, sweetheart. Take me out of here.
Dad, you're embarrassing me. These are my friends.
Yeah, you're embarrassing her, dude.
Anyway, that's it for a deep dive into game technology on multiple platforms, and if you like this kind of technology deep dives into game hardware and all things visual, then keep it IGN, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Oh, man. What are you doing? Hey! Man!
I like them.